The fastest man in America had forgotten how to move forward. As Colt Rivers watched the sunrise paint the track where he'd once been destined for Olympic glory, he couldn't escape one devastating truth: the only race that mattered now was the one he was losing against time, his own body, and the terrifying possibility that without running, he was nothing at all. 6 months ago, this same track had witnessed the moment his world shattered. The crack of the starting gun, the explosive power in his legs as he launched from the blocks, and then, that sickening pop that echoed through the stadium like a gunshot to his dreams. His Achilles tendon, the very thing that had propelled him to national records, had betrayed him in the most crucial moment of his career. Now, sitting alone in the empty stadium as morning mist clung to the track surface, Colt could still hear the phantom sound of footsteps that weren't his own. Other athletes were already out there, their rhythmic breathing and determined strides creating a symphony of purpose that used to include him. The cold metal of the stadium seat pressed against his back, a harsh reminder that he was now a spectator in the world where he'd once been a king. The ache in his injured Achilles was nothing compared to the hollowness in his chest. Who was Colt Rivers without his speed? Without the roar of crowds and the sweet satisfaction of crossing finish lines first? He'd built his entire identity around being fast, being the best, being untouchable. Now he felt invisible, broken, forgotten. What happens when the thing that defines you is the very thing that might be lost forever? If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and join our Dear Love Diaries family. Your special place in this community of heartfelt stories is waiting for you. These passionate journeys of souls connecting against all odds have brought together thousands of beautiful hearts just like yours. Make sure you hit the bell too, so you'll know immediately when a new story unfolds in our diary of love. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd spent his entire life running toward something, and now he was running away from everything: the disappointed looks from his coach, the pitying words from former teammates, the reporters who'd stopped calling months ago. His agent Jim Barnes had tried to stay optimistic, but even he was beginning to use words like realistic timeline and backup plans. Colt's phone buzzed in his pocket, jarring him from his thoughts. A text from Dr. Patterson, his sports medicine physician: appointment confirmed for 2 p.m. today with Aubrey Mlan at Crossroads Rehabilitation. This is your last shot, Colt. She's unconventional but she gets results. Don't blow this. Aubrey Mlan. He'd heard whispers about her in the athletic community, a physical therapist who supposedly worked miracles with athletes everyone else had given up on. Some called her methods unorthodox. Others whispered she was too involved with her patients, that she cared too much. In Colt's experience, caring too much was usually code for being soft, and soft wasn't going to get him back on the track. But as he sat there watching the sun climb higher, watching other people chase their dreams while his collected dust, he realized he was out of options. He'd tried 3 different physical therapists, each one more clinical and detached than the last. They'd manipulated his leg like it was a machine to be fixed rather than part of a human being who was slowly dying inside. Maybe it was time to try someone who cared too much rather than too little. The Crossroads Rehabilitation Center sat in a converted Victorian house on the edge of downtown, its warm brick facade and flowering gardens a stark contrast to the sterile medical buildings Colt had grown accustomed to. As he pushed through the front door, he was immediately struck by the difference. Instead of the harsh fluorescent lighting and antiseptic smell of typical clinics, this place felt almost homey. Soft natural light filtered through large windows, and he could hear the quiet murmur of conversation mixed with sounds of determined effort from various therapy rooms. The receptionist, a friendly woman with silver hair and kind eyes, looked up as he approached. "You must be Colt Rivers. Ms. Mlan is finishing up with another patient, but she'll be right with you. Please, have a seat wherever you're comfortable." Colt chose a chair near the window, his green eyes automatically scanning the space for escape routes, a habit he'd developed over months of disappointing medical appointments. He watched through the glass walls as various patients worked with their therapists. An elderly man was learning to walk again after what looked like a stroke. A teenage girl was working on her shoulder mobility, probably a swimmer. Each person was focused, determined, but there was something else in their faces he hadn't seen in other clinics: hope. "Mr. Rivers?" The voice was warm, confident, with just a hint of musical accent that made his name sound different somehow. "Better." He turned to see a woman approaching him, and his breath caught in his throat in a way that had nothing to do with his injury. Aubrey Mlan was not what he'd expected. She was beautiful, yes, but it was more than that. She moved with a grace that reminded him of his own body in its prime, purposeful, controlled, but with an underlying strength that was unmistakable. Her amber eyes seemed to see everything, and when they met his, he had the unsettling feeling that she was looking past all his carefully constructed defenses. "I'm Aubrey Mlan," she said, extending her hand. Her grip was firm, warm, and lasted just a moment longer than strictly professional. "I've been looking forward to meeting you." Colt stood, towering over her 5'6" frame, and found himself momentarily at a loss for words. He'd prepared his usual defensive speech about not wanting to waste time with touchy-feely approaches, but something about her presence disarmed him. "I assume you've heard I'm difficult," he said instead, falling back on his reputation like armor. To his surprise, she laughed, a genuine, delighted sound that made something tight in his chest loosen slightly. "Mr. Rivers, I work with elite athletes for a living. If you weren't difficult, I'd be concerned about your competitive drive. Shall we head back to my office?" As they walked down the hallway, Colt found himself studying the way she moved, the confident set of her shoulders, the gentle sway that spoke of someone completely comfortable in her own skin. Her treatment room was an extension of the clinic's warm atmosphere. Plants in the corners, soft lighting, and equipment that looked more like it belonged in a high-end gym than a medical facility. "Please, sit wherever you're comfortable," she said, gesturing to several options: a traditional examination table, a comfortable chair, or a padded bench near the window. "I like to start by learning about the person before we talk about the injury." Colt bristled slightly. This was exactly the kind of New Age nonsense he'd been dreading. "Look, Ms. Mlan." "Aubrey," she corrected gently, settling into her own chair with fluid grace. "And before you tell me you just want to focus on your Achilles and get back to running, let me ask you something. How many physical therapists have you seen in the past 6 months?" "3, he admitted reluctantly. "And how much progress have you made with their traditional approaches?" The question hit harder than he'd expected because the answer was obvious to both of them. "That's different, is it?" She leaned forward slightly, and he caught a subtle scent of her perfume, something warm and sophisticated that seemed to wrap around him. "Colt, may I call you Colt? I've read your file. You're one of the most naturally gifted sprinters this country has ever produced. Your dedication and work ethic are legendary. If traditional physical therapy was going to work for you, it would have worked by now." He wanted to argue, but she was right, and they both knew it. "So what are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that maybe, just maybe, healing an elite athlete requires understanding the athlete as well as the injury." Her amber eyes never left his face, and he felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with physical examination. "Your body and your mind have been working together at the highest level for years. Don't you think they might need to heal together too?" Something in her voice, in the way she said his name like it mattered, made him pause. This wasn't the clinical detachment he was used to, but it wasn't the false cheerfulness he'd encountered either. This felt real. "What exactly did Dr. Patterson tell you about me?" he asked. "That you're talented, stubborn, and scared," she said without hesitation. "He also said you were his last hope for a comeback, which tells me he cares about you more than most doctors care about their patients." "And you believe him? About the talented and stubborn parts?" "Absolutely." She smiled, and he found himself almost smiling back despite his best efforts. "About the scared part? I think anyone who's had their entire identity threatened would be scared. The question is whether you're scared enough to try something different." I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever felt like your whole identity was tied to one thing? How did you find your way through? Share your story below. This community is built on supporting each other through life's toughest transitions. For the first time in months, Colt felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. He studied her face, looking for signs of the judgment or pity he'd grown accustomed to, but found neither. What he saw instead was genuine interest, professional confidence, and something else he couldn't quite name. "All right, Aubrey," he said, using her first name deliberately. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," she said simply. "Start with the day you first knew you could run faster than everyone else." And somehow, against all his instincts and defenses, Colt found himself talking. Really talking, for the first time since his injury. He told her about being the skinny kid who discovered he could outrun his problems, about the first time a coach saw his potential, about the years of sacrifice and dedication that had brought him to the edge of Olympic glory. Aubrey listened without interrupting, her eyes never leaving his face, and he found himself sharing details he hadn't even told his closest friends. The pressure he put on himself, the way he'd isolated himself from family and relationships in pursuit of his goals, the terror that without running, he was just another disappointment. "When did you last run for joy instead of achievement?" she asked when he finally paused. The question stopped him cold. I don't remember." "That tells me everything I need to know about where we start," she said, standing gracefully. "But first, I need to examine your injury. Are you comfortable with me doing a hands-on assessment?" Colt nodded, though something in his chest tightened at the thought. Every other therapist had treated his examination like a mechanical inspection, but he had the feeling Aubrey's touch would be entirely different. "I'll need you to lie down on the table," she instructed, her voice taking on a professional tone while maintaining its warmth. "And I need you to tell me immediately if anything causes sharp pain." As Colt positioned himself on the padded table, he was acutely aware of Aubrey moving around the room, washing her hands, gathering supplies. When she approached the table, he caught another whisper of her scent and found his muscles tensing for reasons that had nothing to do with his injury. "Try to relax," she said softly, her hands hovering just above his injured leg. "I know that's easier said than done, but I need to feel what your body is telling me, not what you think I want to hear." Her first touch was tentative, professional, as she began the examination at his knee and slowly worked her way down toward the injury site. Her hands were warm, skilled, and surprisingly strong. But when she reached the area where his Achilles had torn, her touch became something else entirely. Gentle but confident, probing but respectful. "Here?" she asked, her fingers finding the exact spot where the tendon had ruptured. Colt's sharp intake of breath had nothing to do with pain. No one, not in 6 months of examinations, had located the precise source of his injury with such accuracy. "How did you? Your body is telling me a story," she said, her hands continuing their careful exploration. "It's telling me about the trauma, yes, but also about the compensation patterns you've developed, the fear you're holding in this muscle group, the way you've been protecting yourself." Her fingers worked along the length of his Achilles, and Colt found himself fighting an entirely different kind of tension. This wasn't clinical examination, this was the first time since his injury that someone had touched him with genuine care rather than detached professionalism. The sensation was overwhelming, terrifying, and oddly comforting all at once. "You're holding your breath," she observed without looking up from her work. "I didn't realize. It's okay. Just breathe with me." Her voice was calm, steady, and he found himself unconsciously matching the rhythm of her own breathing. "Better. Now tell me what you're feeling." "Pain," he said automatically. "Where? Sharp or dull? Constant or intermittent?" "It's..." He paused, really paying attention to the sensations for the first time in months. "It's not just the Achilles. It's like my whole lower leg is tight, angry." "Exactly." She moved her hands to his calf muscle, and he felt some of the tension begin to release under her skilled touch. Your body has been protecting this injury for 6 months. Every muscle, every tendon, every nerve has been on high alert, bracing for more trauma. As she worked, Colt found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't since before his injury. Her touch was professional but infused with a warmth that spoke of someone who truly understood bodies, understood healing, understood the intricate connection between physical and emotional pain. "When was the last time you felt safe in your own body?" she asked, her hands continuing their careful assessment. The question hit him like a physical blow because he realized he couldn't remember. "I don't know." Their eyes met across the space of the examination table, and something passed between them, an understanding, a recognition of shared experience with loss and healing. In that moment, Colt saw past her professional demeanor to the woman beneath, and what he saw there made his heart race in a way that had nothing to do with anxiety. "That's where we start," she said softly, her hands still warm against his skin. "Not with your speed or your times or your comeback timeline. We start with you feeling safe enough to heal." For the first time since his injury, Colt felt truly seen. Not as a broken athlete or a disappointing patient or a former champion, but as a human being who was scared and hurt and desperately hoping that someone, somewhere, could help him find his way back to himself. And looking into Aubrey's amber eyes, feeling the gentle strength of her hands on his injured leg, he began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could. Over the following weeks, Colt found himself looking forward to his appointments with Aubrey in a way that surprised him. Her treatment room had become a sanctuary where he could drop the pretense of being fine, where he didn't have to perform or prove anything to anyone. She pushed him harder than any therapist before her, but never without understanding, never without compassion. "Your body remembers being fast," she told him during one particularly challenging session as she guided him through a complex balance exercise. "But it also remembers being hurt. We need to teach it that healing doesn't mean weakness." Colt wobbled on the stability disc, his injured leg trembling with the effort of supporting his weight. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and frustration built in his chest like a familiar enemy. "This is ridiculous. I used to run a 4-minute mile, and now I can't even stand on one foot?" "You used to run on pure talent and determination," Aubrey said, moving closer to spot him, her presence immediately steadying. "Now you're learning to run with wisdom and strength. There's a difference." Her hand ghosted near his back, ready to catch him if he fell, and the warmth of her proximity sent an electric current through his body that had nothing to do with the exercise. "I don't understand the difference. Talent can take you far, but it can also betray you when you need it most." Her voice was gentle but firm. "Wisdom teaches you to listen to your body instead of demanding it obey. Strength comes from knowing your limits and choosing to respect them." Colt managed to hold the position for the full 30 seconds, his leg burning with effort but his balance steady. When he stepped down, Aubrey's smile of approval sent warmth flooding through his chest. "See? Your body is stronger than you remember. It just needed to remember it could trust you not to hurt it again." These moments of breakthrough were becoming more frequent, and with them came a dangerous intimacy that neither of them acknowledged but both felt. There were the accidental touches, her hand steadying his shoulder, his fingers brushing hers as she handed him equipment. There were the shared laughs over his competitive reactions to simple exercises, the way she could tease him into pushing himself without triggering his defensive walls. Most dangerous of all were the conversations that wandered far from physical therapy into territory that felt distinctly personal. Like the afternoon when rain drummed against the windows of her treatment room, and somehow they'd gone from discussing his rehabilitation timeline to sharing childhood memories. "I always knew I was different," Colt found himself saying as he worked through a series of calf raises. "Not better, just separate. Like I was built for something specific, and if I couldn't do that thing, I didn't know what I was for." Aubrey sat cross-legged on her chair, watching his form with professional attention, but her eyes held a softness that suggested she was listening with more than clinical interest. "When did you first feel that separateness?" 8 years old. School field day. He paused in his exercise, lost in the memory. I'd always been fast, but that day I left every other kid so far behind that they stopped the race to make sure I hadn't cheated. The look on their faces, it wasn't admiration. It was like they suddenly realized I wasn't quite the same species. That must have been lonely. The simple observation hit him harder than he expected. Most people focused on the gift of his speed, the opportunities it had given him. Aubrey was the first person to recognize the isolation that came with it. It was, he admitted. But it was also intoxicating. Being that different, that special, it became my identity before I was old enough to understand what that meant. And now? Now I don't know who I am without it. The words came out more vulnerable than he'd intended, and he found himself avoiding her eyes as he resumed his calf raises. Colt. Her voice was soft, and when he looked up, she was leaning forward in her chair, her amber eyes holding his with gentle intensity. You're still the same person who outran everyone at 8 years old. The speed was never what made you special, it was just how your specialness showed itself. Something cracked open in his chest at her words, a fissure in the armor he'd built around his wounded identity. What if the speed was all there ever was? Then we wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation. She stood, moving closer to where he worked, and her proximity made his skin hyper-aware of every molecule of air between them. Speed is what you could do. But listening to your fears, pushing through them anyway, showing up here every day even when it's hard, that's who you are. Their eyes locked, and for a moment the professional boundaries that kept them safe seemed as fragile as morning frost. Colt felt the pull toward her like gravity, the dangerous desire to close the physical space between them and see if she felt the same magnetic attraction that had been building for weeks. Instead, he stepped back, breaking the spell. I should probably get going. Don't want to keep you past your normal hours. Colt, same time Thursday? He asked, already moving toward his things, needing distance before he did something they'd both regret. Of course. Her professional mask slipped back into place, but not before he caught a flash of something that looked like disappointment. Take care of yourself. As he drove home through the rain, Colt couldn't shake the image of Aubrey's eyes in that unguarded moment, the way she'd said his name like it meant something more than just patient identification. He was playing with fire, and he knew it. She was his therapist, the one person who might actually be able to help him heal. Getting involved with her would be selfish, stupid, and probably destructive to both their careers. But as he sat in his empty apartment that night, staring at the wall of trophies and medals that felt like relics from someone else's life, he couldn't stop thinking about the way her hand had felt when it steadied his shoulder, the warmth of her smile when he succeeded at something difficult, the genuine care in her voice when she asked about his fears. For the first time since his injury, Colt Rivers was running towards something instead of away from it. And that something had amber eyes and a laugh that made him remember what joy felt like. Meanwhile, across town, Aubrey McLean was having her own dangerous thoughts as she locked up the clinic for the night. She'd always been professional with her clients, maintaining clear boundaries that protected both her and them from the complications that could arise when healing became too personal. But Colt Rivers was different. Beneath his defensive arrogance, she'd glimpsed a vulnerability that called to something deep in her healer's soul. And beneath her professional compassion, she was beginning to recognize feelings that had nothing to do with physical therapy and everything to do with the way his green eyes lit up when he laughed, the unconscious grace in his movements even when he was struggling, the courage it took for him to show up and try again every day despite his fears. She thought about her brother Marcus, killed in a car accident 3 years ago after ignoring symptoms that might have saved his life if he'd trusted someone enough to share them. She'd become a physical therapist partly to honor his memory, to be the kind of healer who saw beyond the surface to the person beneath. But with Colt, she was beginning to see too much. And that scared her more than she was willing to admit. As she drove through the rain-slicked streets toward her apartment, Aubrey found herself hoping that Thursday would come quickly, and simultaneously hoping she could find a way to maintain her professional distance when it did. Neither of them was prepared for what Thursday would bring. Chapter 2. Thursday arrived with unexpected complications. Colt's agent Jim Barnes called that morning with news that sent ice through his veins. Rico Martins is retiring, Jim said without preamble. Knee finally gave out completely. He's announcing it today, and the media's going to be all over this story. Two of the country's fastest sprinters sidelined in the same year? They're going to want to talk to you, Colt. Rico had been Colt's training partner for 3 years, a fellow sprinter whose competitive times had pushed them both to greater heights. If Rico was giving up, what did that say about Colt's own chances? I'm not talking to any reporters, Colt said, staring out his apartment window at the gray morning sky. I know, but they're going to try anyway. And there's something else. Jim's voice took on a careful tone that Colt had learned to dread. Dr. Walsh wants to see you. Kevin Walsh, the sports medicine specialist who worked with the Olympic team. He's heard about your progress with this Mlan woman, and he thinks he can get you back on track faster. Dr. Kevin Walsh. Colt knew the name, every serious athlete did. Walsh had a reputation for getting athletes back to competition quickly, sometimes before other doctors thought it was safe. His methods were aggressive, focused purely on performance rather than long-term health. I'm not interested, Colt said. Colt, think about this. Walsh has connections to the Olympic Training Center. He could fast-track your comeback, get you on the team for next year's World Championships. This Mlan therapist is nice, I'm sure, but she's not working with Olympic-level athletes. You need someone who understands the pressure you're under. The pressure. That familiar weight that had driven Colt to greatness and ultimately to his breaking point. I said I'm not interested. Just meet with him. What could it hurt? After hanging up, Colt sat in his kitchen staring at his coffee, Jim's words echoing in his head. What could it hurt? Everything, possibly. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Was he wasting time with Aubrey's careful, methodical approach when he could be pushing harder, returning faster? By the time he arrived at Crossroads for his afternoon appointment, his mood had darkened considerably. The peaceful atmosphere of the clinic felt stifling rather than comforting, and when Aubrey greeted him with her usual warm smile, he found himself unable to return it. Rough morning? She asked, leading him back to her treatment room. You could say that. He dropped into the chair by the window instead of moving toward the treatment table, his body language clearly defensive. Aubrey settled into her own chair, studying his face with those perceptive amber eyes. Want to talk about it? Not particularly. He knew he was being rude, but the conversation with Jim had stirred up all his old anxieties about time, about falling behind, about whether he was being too cautious in his recovery. Okay. She waited, letting the silence stretch between them. It was one of her techniques, creating space for him to fill with whatever he needed to say. Usually it worked, but today it just irritated him. My teammate Rico is retiring, he said finally. Knee injury. Can't come back. I'm sorry. That must be difficult to hear. He's 2 years younger than me. Colt's hands clenched into fists. 2 years younger, and he's giving up. What does that say about my chances? It says that he's not you. Aubrey's voice remained calm, but he caught a flicker of something in her expression. Every injury is different, every athlete is different. Rico's situation has nothing to do with yours. Doesn't it? Colt stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Maybe I'm just kidding myself. Maybe this slow, careful approach is just delaying the inevitable. What's really bothering you, Colt? He turned to face her, and the concern in her eyes only fueled his frustration. My agent wants me to see another doctor. Kevin Walsh. He thinks I could be back to competition in 3 months instead of 6. Something shifted in Aubrey's expression, a tightening around her eyes that suggested she knew exactly who Kevin Walsh was and what his approach entailed. And what do you think? I think maybe I've been playing it too safe. The words came out harsher than he intended. Maybe I need someone who understands what it takes to compete at the Olympic level. And you don't think I understand? Her voice remained professional, but there was an edge to it now. You work with weekend warriors and high school athletes, Colt said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. This is different. The pressure, the timeline, the stakes. You can't possibly understand what it's like to have everything you've worked for hanging by a thread. The moment the words left his mouth, he knew he'd gone too far. Aubrey's face went very still, and she stood slowly, moving to her desk with measured steps. You're right, she said quietly, her back to him as she organized papers that didn't need organizing. I've never competed at the Olympic level. I've never had millions of people watching my every move, never had my entire identity tied to physical performance. Aubrey, but I have watched someone I loved ignore warning signs because they were afraid of seeming weak. She turned to face him, and the pain in her eyes made his chest constrict. I have held my brother's hand as he died in a hospital bed because he was too proud to admit he needed help until it was too late. The room went dead silent. Colt felt like he'd been punched in the stomach, all his anger deflating into shame. Marcus was a boxer, Aubrey continued, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly. Lightweight division, heading toward a championship bout. He'd been having headaches for weeks, dizzy spells, but he didn't want anyone to think he was making excuses. Sound familiar? Colt wanted to apologize, to take back every thoughtless word, but his throat felt like it was closing. By the time he finally came to me, the brain bleed was too advanced. The doctor said if he'd gotten help even a week earlier. She stopped, collecting herself with visible effort. So no, I don't understand Olympic pressure. But I understand what happens when athletes prioritize performance over health. I've lived with those consequences every day for 3 years. Aubrey, I'm sorry. I didn't know, of course you didn't know. She moved back to her chair, but her posture remained rigid. Because despite what you seem to think, I don't make my patients' therapy sessions about my personal life. I maintain professional boundaries for good reasons. The formal distance in her voice cut deeper than anger would have. In one carelessly spoken moment, he'd destroyed weeks of carefully built trust and connection. I was out of line, Colt said quietly. Completely out of line. You've done more for me in a month than 3 other therapists did in 6 months combined. I was just scared. Scared of what? Of taking too long. Of missing my window. He ran his hands through his hair, searching for words. Of caring more about this than about getting back to running. Aubrey's expression softened slightly. This. He gestured between them, finally naming the thing they'd both been carefully not acknowledging. Whatever this is that's been happening between us. It scares the hell out of me. For a long moment, they stared at each other across the small treatment room. The air between them felt charged, heavy with unspoken feelings and dangerous possibilities. We should focus on your therapy, Aubrey said finally, but her voice lacked conviction. Should we? Colt took a step closer, and then another, until only a few feet separated them. Because I can't focus on anything else when I'm around you. I can't stop thinking about the way you laugh, or how your eyes light up when I achieve something difficult, or what it would feel like to, Colt, stop. But she didn't step away, and the breathless quality of her voice undermined the command. Stop what? Stop noticing that you feel this too? Stop caring about the woman who's been putting me back together piece by piece? He was close enough now to see the rapid pulse at the base of her throat, to catch the subtle intake of her breath. Stop wanting something I have no right to want. You're my patient, she whispered, but the words sounded like she was trying to convince herself as much as him. I'm a man who's falling for his physical therapist, he said simply. And unless I'm completely misreading the situation, she might be falling for him too. Aubrey's professional mask was cracking, and through the fissures he could see longing and fear and something that looked like hope. This is a terrible idea. Probably. He reached up slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and when she didn't, he cupped her face gently in his palm. But I've made a career out of terrible ideas that turned out to be the best decisions of my life. For a heartbeat, she leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed. Then reality reasserted itself, and she stepped back with obvious effort. I need you to leave, she said, but her voice was rough with emotion. Aubrey, please. I need to think. Colt wanted to stay, to push past her defenses and see where this dangerous moment might lead. But the vulnerability in her eyes reminded him that she'd already lost someone she cared about to reckless decisions. He wouldn't be another casualty of poor judgment. Okay, he said softly. But Aubrey? What's happening between us isn't going away just because we don't talk about it. That evening, Aubrey sat in her apartment with a cup of tea growing cold in her hands, staring out at the city lights and trying to make sense of the chaos in her chest. She'd built her entire professional identity around maintaining appropriate boundaries, around being the stable, trustworthy presence her patients needed for healing. But Colt Rivers was systematically dismantling every wall she'd carefully constructed. His vulnerability called to her healer's instincts, yes, but it was more than that. His fierce determination reminded her of her brother's fighting spirit. His hidden gentleness beneath the defensive exterior made her want to know every secret he'd never shared with anyone else. And the way he'd looked at her today, the rough honesty in his voice when he admitted his feelings, it had awakened something in her that had been dormant since Marcus's death. The desire to be seen and valued not just for what she could provide, but for who she was underneath her professional competence. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Ruth Jenkins, her mentor and the clinic owner. Heard about the Walsh inquiry. You holding up okay? So word was already getting around. Kevin Walsh had probably contacted Ruth directly, asking about Aubrey's methods and qualifications. It was exactly the kind of professional scrutiny she'd been dreading. She typed back. I'm fine. Just focusing on patient care. But as she set the phone aside, Aubrey wondered if that was true. Was she focusing on Colt's care, or was she compromising his recovery by allowing personal feelings to cloud her judgment? The next morning brought clarity in the form of an unexpected visitor. Tom "Iron" Coleman, the legendary former sprinter who now mentored young athletes, was waiting in the clinic's reception area when Aubrey arrived for work. Ms. McLean? I was hoping we could talk. About Colt Rivers. Tom Coleman was a man who commanded respect in athletic circles, a former Olympic medalist who'd successfully transitioned from competition to coaching. If he was here, it meant Colt's situation was more complicated than she'd realized. I'm not sure what I can tell you, Aubrey said carefully. Patient confidentiality. I'm not here for medical information, Tom interrupted gently. I'm here because I care about that boy, and I'm worried he's about to make a mistake that could end his career permanently. They settled in Aubrey's office, and Tom's weathered face was serious as he leaned forward in his chair. Kevin Walsh called me yesterday, he said without preamble. Wants to fast-track Colt back to competition. Push him harder, get him back on the track in half the time you're recommending. And I've seen what happens when athletes rush back from major injuries. I've seen careers end, bodies break down, lives destroyed because someone was too impatient to heal properly. Tom's eyes held the weight of hard-earned wisdom. I've also seen your work, Ms. McLean. 3 of my former athletes have come through this clinic, and every one of them came back stronger than before. Aubrey felt a warm glow at the unexpected endorsement, but she kept her expression neutral. I appreciate that, but Colt has to make his own decisions about his care. He does. But he's scared right now, and scared athletes make stupid choices. Tom studied her face intently. I think you understand him better than most. He's not just another client to you, is he? The perceptive question caught her off guard. What makes you say that? Because I've never seen him trust anyone the way he trusts you. And I've never seen you get personally invested in a patient's outcome the way you have with him. Tom's smile was kind but knowing. It's not necessarily a bad thing, as long as you both handle it carefully. I don't know what you mean, Ms. McLean. I've been around athletes and the people who work with them for 40 years. I know what healing looks like, and I know what something more than healing looks like. He stood, moving toward the door. Just remember that sometimes the best thing you can do for someone you care about is help them make the hard choice instead of the easy one. After Tom left, Aubrey sat in her office thinking about his words. The hard choice versus the easy one. Was encouraging Colt to stay with her slow, methodical approach the hard choice or the easy one? Was she protecting his long-term health, or was she protecting her own growing feelings for him? When Colt arrived for his appointment that afternoon, the tension from their previous session still lingered between them. But there was something else in his demeanor, a new resolve that made her stomach flutter with anxiety. I've been thinking about what you said, he began without preamble. About professional boundaries. Colt, let me finish. He sat in the chair across from her, his green eyes serious. You're right. This situation is complicated, and I don't want to make it worse by pushing for something that could hurt your career or compromise my recovery. Relief and disappointment warred in her chest. That's very mature. But I also can't pretend I don't feel what I feel. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to that rough, intimate tone that made her pulse quicken. So I have a proposition. I'm listening. Give me 6 more weeks. 6 weeks to prove that I can get better with your methods, that this slow and careful approach can work. If I'm not making the progress we both think I should be, I'll consider switching to Walsh's program. And if you are making progress? Colt's eyes held hers with unwavering intensity. Then we talk about what comes next. For my career, and for. He gestured between them. This. Aubrey felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down at either flight or a very long fall. Every instinct told her to step back, to maintain the safe distance that would protect them both. But looking at Colt's face, seeing the hope and determination there, she realized that stepping back might be the biggest mistake of her life. 6 weeks, she agreed softly. 6 weeks, he confirmed. And as they moved into the familiar routine of his therapy session, both of them knew that everything had changed. The next 6 weeks wouldn't just determine Colt's physical recovery, they would determine whether two people who'd found something unexpected and beautiful in each other's broken places were brave enough to fight for it. The stakes had never been higher, and the race against time had never felt more urgent. But for the first time since his injury, Colt Rivers wasn't running away from something. He was running toward it. Chapter 3. The following weeks passed in a blur of intense therapy sessions and carefully maintained professional boundaries that felt more fragile with each passing day. Colt threw himself into his recovery with renewed determination, pushing his body harder than he had since before the injury. And Aubrey watched him transform, not just physically but emotionally, as he began to rediscover the joy in movement that he'd lost somewhere along his climb to greatness. But the outside world wasn't content to let them exist in their carefully constructed bubble. Jim Barnes increased his pressure campaign, calling daily with updates on other athletes who were making faster comebacks, opportunities that might disappear if Colt didn't return to competition soon. The media began sniffing around the clinic, drawn by rumors of the unconventional therapist who was supposedly working miracles with the fallen Olympic hopeful. And then there was Dr. Kevin Walsh himself, who began showing up at track meets and athletic events, making pointed comments about athletes who prioritized comfort over competition, who chose gentle rehabilitation over the aggressive treatment that champions demanded. He's trying to get in your head, Aubrey told Colt during a particularly challenging session in the 4th week of their agreement. Don't let him. Colt was working through a complex agility drill, his movements more fluid and confident than they'd been since his injury. But she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched when he thought she wasn't looking. "Maybe he has a point," Colt said, not breaking his concentration as he navigated the cone pattern. Rico made his comeback attempt with Walsh's program. At least he tried. And where did that get him? Retired at 25. Colt finished the drill and grabbed his water bottle, avoiding her eyes. But maybe that's better than being stuck in therapy limbo forever. Aubrey felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "Is that what you think this is? Limbo? I don't know what to think anymore." He sat heavily on the edge of the treatment table, and she could see the weight of external pressure in every line of his body. "My sister Claire called yesterday. First time she's spoken to me in 2 years." This was news to Aubrey. Colt had mentioned having family, but he'd always been vague about the details. "What did she say?" "That she saw an interview with Walsh where he mentioned my case. Claire thinks I'm wasting time, that I'm letting fear hold me back from getting the help I really need." Colt's laugh was bitter. "She said it reminded her of when we were kids and I used to hide in my room after losing a race instead of facing the fact that I needed to train harder." "And you think she's right?" "I think everyone in my life except you believes I should be pushing harder, moving faster, taking bigger risks." He finally looked at her, and the confusion in his green eyes made her heart ache. "What if they're right? What if I'm using this slow approach as an excuse to avoid finding out whether I can really come back?" Before Aubrey could respond, her phone buzzed with an urgent text from Dr. Jenkins. "Walsh filed a formal complaint with the state board. Need to see you immediately." The blood drained from her face as she read the message. A formal complaint could trigger an investigation into her methods, her credentials, her entire practice. If Walsh had positioned it correctly, it could end her career. "Everything okay?" Colt asked, noticing her expression. Yes. We should probably call it a day. I need to handle something at the office." But as Aubrey rushed through the motions of ending their session, her mind was racing. Walsh wasn't just targeting Colt, he was targeting her. And if he succeeded in discrediting her methods or her professional standing, it wouldn't just affect her career. It would destroy any chance Colt had of completing his recovery with her program. These moments when love and duty collide are never easy. Have you ever had to choose between what others expected and what your heart knew was right? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this journey, please hit that like button, it means the world to me. The meeting with Dr. Jenkins was as bad as Aubrey had feared. Walsh had filed a complaint alleging that her methods were unproven, that she was keeping Colt from receiving appropriate care for personal rather than professional reasons, and that her emotional involvement with a high-profile patient represented a breach of professional ethics. "There's no evidence for any of it, Dr. Jenkins assured her, but her weathered face was grave. "However, the board has to investigate any formal complaint. They'll want to review Colt's file, interview both of you separately, and observe your treatment sessions." "How long will that take?" "Weeks. Maybe months." Ruth's expression softened with sympathy. "Aubrey, I know how much you care about that young man's recovery. But you need to seriously consider whether continuing as his therapist is in either of your best interests right now." The suggestion hit Aubrey like a physical blow. Transfer Colt to another therapist? Abandon his care just when he was making real progress? "I can't do that to him. Not now." "You might not have a choice. If the board finds any evidence of personal involvement, there hasn't been any personal involvement." The words came out more defensive than Aubrey intended. "I've maintained appropriate professional boundaries." Ruth studied her face with the sharp eyes of someone who'd been mentoring young therapists for decades. "Have you?" "Because from where I'm sitting, this feels very personal indeed." That evening, Aubrey sat in her apartment trying to process the day's events and figure out her next move. The ethical complaint was serious enough, but the real problem was that Ruth was right. Her feelings for Colt had moved far beyond professional concern. She was emotionally invested in his recovery in a way that went against everything she'd been trained to believe about therapeutic relationships. Her phone rang, and she was surprised to see Colt's name on the display. They never spoke outside of scheduled appointments. "Aubrey? I hope it's okay that I'm calling. I got your number from the clinic directory." "It's fine. What's wrong?" She could hear tension in his voice, something that sounded like barely controlled panic. "I need to see you. Tonight. Something's happened, and I..." He paused, and she heard him take a shaky breath. "I can't handle this alone." Thunder rumbled in the distance, and Aubrey glanced out her window to see storm clouds gathering on the horizon. "What's happened? Can I come over? Please? I know it's not appropriate, but I don't have anyone else I can talk to about this." Every professional instinct screamed that inviting him to her apartment was exactly the kind of boundary violation that would give Walsh's complaint credibility. But the raw need in Colt's voice overrode her caution. "Okay. I'll text you my address." 30 minutes later, Colt stood on her doorstep soaked from the rain that had begun falling in earnest. His hair was plastered to his head, his shirt clinging to his chest, and his eyes held a wild desperation that immediately put her on high alert. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. "You're drenched. Let me get you a towel." But as soon as she closed the door behind him, Colt turned to face her with an expression of such anguish that she forgot about towels or appropriate boundaries or anything except the fact that he was clearly in pain. "Jim showed me the complaint Walsh filed," he said without preamble. "He's trying to destroy your career because of me." Aubrey's stomach dropped. "How did Jim get?" "Walsh sent him a copy. He wanted to make sure I understood the consequences of continuing with your program." Colt's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "He's using me as a weapon against you, and I won't let that happen. Colt, I'm withdrawing from your program." The words came out flat, final. "Effective immediately. I'll issue a statement saying that I decided to pursue a more aggressive treatment approach, that it was entirely my choice and had nothing to do with the quality of care you provided." "You can't do that." The response was immediate, visceral. "You're not ready for Walsh's program. If you push too hard now, then I'll end up like Rico, and at least you'll still have your career." Colt moved closer, and she could see rainwater still dripping from his hair, could smell the storm on his skin. "I won't be the reason you lose everything you've worked for. That's not your decision to make. Isn't it?" His green eyes blazed with emotion. "I'm the one who created this situation by feeling what I feel for you. I'm the one who crossed lines I had no business crossing." The air between them crackled with tension that had nothing to do with the storm outside. They were standing too close, close enough that Aubrey could see the rapid pulse at the base of his throat, could feel the heat radiating from his rain-chilled body. "You think you're the only one who crossed lines?" The words tumbled out before she could stop them, 3 weeks of suppressed emotion finally breaking free. "You think I've been maintaining professional objectivity while you've been the only one struggling with inappropriate feelings?" Colt went very still. "Aubrey. I've been lying to myself for weeks," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Telling myself that the way I look forward to your appointments, the way I worry about you when you're not here, the way I lie awake at night thinking about your recovery, telling myself that's normal professional concern. And it's not? No." She moved closer, eliminating the last few inches between them. "It's not professional at all. Because somewhere along the way, helping you heal stopped being about physical therapy and started being about what?" His voice was rough, intense. "About falling in love with you." The admission hung between them like a lightning bolt, illuminating everything they'd been carefully avoiding. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then Colt's hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones with reverent gentleness. "Say it again," he whispered. "I'm in love with you." The words came easier this time, like a dam bursting. "I'm in love with your determination and your vulnerability and the way you fight for everything you want. I'm in love with your terrible sense of humor and your competitive streak and the way you look at me like I'm something precious. You are something precious." His forehead rested against hers, their breath mingling in the charged space between them. "You're everything I never knew I was looking for." Outside, thunder crashed overhead, and the lights flickered briefly before steadying. But inside Aubrey's apartment, the only electricity that mattered was arcing between two people who had finally stopped fighting the inevitable. "This is crazy," Aubrey whispered, even as her hands moved to rest against his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart beneath her palms. "Completely insane," Colt agreed, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw. "We could both lose everything. Everything except each other. Is that enough?" Instead of answering with words, Aubrey rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, like they were both afraid this moment might shatter if they moved too quickly. But when Colt's arms came around her, pulling her closer, the kiss deepened into something hungry and desperate and full of weeks of suppressed longing. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and the storm outside seemed to have moved inside the room with them. "I can't let you sacrifice your career for me," Aubrey said, her hands fisted in his shirt as if she could physically hold him in place. "And I can't let you sacrifice yours for me." His smile was soft and sad and entirely too beautiful. "Looks like we have a problem. A big one." She pulled back enough to look into his eyes, seeing her own conflict reflected there. "What do we do?" Before Colt could answer, another flash of lightning illuminated the room, followed immediately by a crash of thunder that shook the windows. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely, plunging them into darkness broken only by the occasional lightning flash. "Looks like Mother Nature made the decision for us," Colt said with a soft laugh. "We're not going anywhere tonight." Aubrey felt her way to the kitchen drawer where she kept emergency candles, lighting several and placing them around the living room. The flickering light created an intimate atmosphere that made the space feel smaller, more private, like a sanctuary carved out of the storm. "I should call the clinic," she said, settling onto the couch next to where Colt had taken a seat. "Let Ruth know about the power outage in case anyone needs to reach me." But as she reached for her phone, Colt's hand covered hers, stopping the movement. "In a minute," he said softly. "Right now, I just want to sit here with you and pretend the rest of the world doesn't exist." So they sat in the candlelight, not quite touching but close enough to feel each other's warmth, and talked about everything they'd been holding back. Colt told her about the loneliness of being exceptional, about the weight of other people's expectations, about the terror of facing a future where he might never run competitively again. Aubrey shared her own fears, about failing someone she cared, about the way she'd failed Marcus, about opening her heart only to lose again, about being valued only for what she could provide rather than who she was underneath her professional competence. "You know what I realized tonight?" Colt said during a lull in their conversation, his voice soft in the candlelit darkness. "I've been so focused on getting back to who I was before the injury that I never considered I might become someone better." "Better how?" "More complete. More human." He turned to face her fully, his green eyes reflecting the candlelight. "You've taught me that strength isn't about never showing weakness, it's about being brave enough to be vulnerable with someone who matters. And you've taught me that sometimes the greatest healing happens when you stop protecting yourself and start trusting someone else with your heart." Aubrey's voice was barely above a whisper. "Even when it's terrifying." They moved closer, drawn together by gravity and desire and the simple human need for connection. When Colt's lips found hers again, it was with a tenderness that spoke of love rather than mere passion, of two souls recognizing each other across the space of their individual wounds. This time, they didn't pull apart when the kiss deepened. They let themselves fall into the moment, into each other, into the realization that some risks were worth taking even when the outcome was uncertain. In the soft glow of candlelight, with the storm raging outside and the world held at bay, Aubrey Mlan and Colt Rivers finally stopped running from the connection that had been building between them from their very first meeting. They had found each other in the ruins of his broken dreams and her guarded heart, and for tonight at least, that was enough. Tomorrow would bring decisions and consequences and the harsh light of reality. But tonight, they had this. The whispered confessions, the gentle touches, the profound intimacy of two people choosing to heal together rather than apart. When morning came, they would face whatever challenges awaited them. But they would face them together, and that made all the difference in the world. The storm outside began to quiet as dawn approached, but the transformation inside Aubrey's apartment was just beginning. Two people who had started as therapist and patient were about to discover what it meant to be something much more powerful, partners in healing, in love, and in the brave choice to build a future that honored both their dreams and their hearts. Chapter 4. The morning after the storm brought clarity and complications in equal measure. Aubrey woke in Colt's arms on her couch, surrounded by the waxy remnants of candles and the soft gray light of dawn filtering through her windows. For a moment, she allowed herself to savor the warmth of his body against hers, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the peace that came from finally admitting the truth they'd both been avoiding. Then reality crashed back in like a cold wave. "We need to talk about what happens next," she said softly, not wanting to wake him but knowing they couldn't avoid the conversation any longer. Colt stirred, his arms tightening around her reflexively before his eyes opened and the same realization hit him. "Good morning to you too," he murmured, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "I'm serious, Colt. The ethics board investigation, Walsh's complaint, your recovery timeline, we can't pretend last night exists in a vacuum." He sat up slowly, running his hands through his hair as he gathered his thoughts. "You're right. But I meant what I said yesterday. I won't let you lose your career because of me. And I won't let you compromise your recovery because of me." Aubrey pulled away reluctantly, needing physical distance to think clearly. "There has to be another way." "Maybe there is." Colt was quiet for a moment, staring out at the brightening sky. "What if I formally requested a transfer to another therapist? Not to Walsh, but to someone else in your clinic. Someone whose methods you trust." "That doesn't solve the ethics complaint." "It might. If I voluntarily transfer my care and make it clear that our personal relationship developed after the therapeutic relationship ended, the board would have less grounds for censure." His green eyes met hers with steady determination. "It's not perfect, but it's a start." Aubrey wanted to argue, to find flaws in his logic, but she couldn't deny the practicality of the suggestion. "Dr. Sarah Chen is excellent with sports injuries. If you transferred to her, then you could work with me on my recovery without being my primary therapist. You could consult on my case, provide oversight, ensure I'm getting the kind of careful treatment I need." Colt moved closer again, taking her hands in his. "And we could explore this thing between us without destroying either of our careers." It wasn't a perfect solution, there would still be scrutiny, still be complications. But it offered them a path forward that didn't require choosing between love and professional integrity. It could work, Aubrey admitted. "But Colt, you need to understand what you're giving up. Sarah is good, but she doesn't know your case like I do. It could slow your progress. Or it could be exactly what I need." His smile was soft. "Sure. Maybe learning to trust other people with my care is part of my healing too. Maybe stopping trying to control every aspect of my recovery is how I actually get better." 3 days later, they sat in Dr. Jenkins's office explaining their proposal. Ruth listened with the poker face of someone who'd navigated the complexities of medical ethics for decades, asking pointed questions about timeline and methodology and professional boundaries. "This is highly irregular," she said finally. "But not unprecedented. If Mr. Rivers voluntarily requests the transfer and you both sign affidavits stating that your personal relationship developed after the therapeutic relationship ended, the ethics board will likely drop their investigation. And if they don't? Aubrey asked. Then we deal with that when it happens. Ruth's expression softened slightly. Aubrey, you're one of the most dedicated therapists I've ever worked with. Don't let Kevin Walsh's political maneuvering make you doubt your abilities or your judgment. The transfer went more smoothly than either of them had dared hope. Dr. Sarah Chen proved to be not just skilled but intuitive, quickly understanding Colt's complex injury pattern and emotional needs. Under her primary care, with Aubrey consulting on the more challenging aspects of his recovery, Colt's progress accelerated rather than slowed. More importantly, freed from the constraints of the therapist-patient dynamic, Colt and Aubrey's relationship deepened in ways that surprised them both. They talked for hours about their dreams beyond their current careers, his growing interest in sports psychology and coaching, her desire to expand holistic treatment methods for athletes dealing with career-ending injuries. You know what I love about us? Colt said one evening as they walked through the park near Aubrey's apartment, his gait strong and sure for the first time since his injury. We're not trying to get back to who we were before. We're becoming who we're supposed to be. And who are we supposed to be? Partners. He stopped walking and turned to face her, his hands gentle as they framed her face. In every sense of the word. Professional collaborators, emotional supports, and... He leaned down to brush his lips against hers. Whatever else we decide to become. 6 weeks after the transfer, Colt was cleared for light running. Not sprinting, not competitive training, but actual running for the first time in over 8 months. He asked Aubrey to be there for his first session back on the track, and she arrived at the rehabilitation facility's indoor track to find him standing at the starting line with an expression of mingled excitement and terror. "What if I can't do it?" he asked as she approached. "What if my body's forgotten how?" "Then you try again tomorrow, and the day after that, until it remembers." Aubrey stood beside him at the line, looking down the straightaway that represented so much more than a simple test of physical capability. "But Colt? Your body hasn't forgotten. It's just learned to be more careful, more wise." He nodded, rolling his shoulders to release tension, then settled into the familiar crouch of a sprinter's start. But instead of the explosive launch that had once defined his running style, he began with a gentle jog, feeling his way back into the rhythm of movement. For the first 100 meters, Aubrey held her breath, watching for any sign of pain or compensation in his gait. But Colt's form was smooth, controlled, beautiful in its restraint. He wasn't running like someone trying to prove he was healed. He was running like someone who finally understood the difference between speed and velocity, between performance and joy. As he rounded the first turn, his pace increased slightly, but not with the desperate urgency of his pre-injury training. This was running with wisdom, with respect for his body's limits and capabilities. When he completed the full 400-meter lap, his face was bright with tears and triumph. "How did it feel?" Aubrey asked as he jogged back to where she stood. "Like coming home," he said simply. "Not to who I was, but to who I'm becoming." 2 months later, Crossroads Rehabilitation hosted its first annual symposium on holistic sports medicine, co-presented by Aubrey McLean and Colt Rivers. The event drew therapists and athletes from across the country, eager to learn about innovative approaches that addressed both physical and emotional healing. "The goal isn't to return athletes to their previous state," Aubrey explained to the packed auditorium. "It's to help them become stronger, more complete versions of themselves. Physical healing without emotional integration is incomplete healing." Colt followed her presentation with his own perspective as a patient-turned-advocate. "I used to think vulnerability was weakness," he told the audience. "I thought admitting I needed help was the same as admitting defeat. But real strength, the kind that sustains you through setbacks and carries you toward new goals. That comes from having the courage to be honest about your limitations and trusting other people to help you transcend them." After the symposium, they walked hand in hand through the downtown area where their journey had begun, past the clinic where they'd first met, toward the future they were building together. "I have something to tell you," Colt said as they paused in front of the track where he'd sat alone and broken just months earlier. "I've been offered a spot on the Olympic training team. Assistant coach position, working with young sprinters." Aubrey felt her heart leap with excitement for him. "Colt, that's incredible. When do you start?" "That depends." He turned to face her, and she was surprised to see nervous excitement in his expression. "The position is in Colorado Springs Training Center headquarters." "Oh." The implications hit her immediately. A dream job for him, but it would mean leaving Crossroads, leaving the work they'd built together. "But," Colt continued, reaching into his jacket pocket, "I did some research. There's a sports medicine clinic there that's been looking for someone with your exact background and philosophy. They want to expand their holistic treatment programs, and when I mentioned your name..." He pulled out a formal-looking letter. "They'd like to interview you for the head therapist position." Aubrey took the letter with trembling hands, scanning the details of an opportunity that seemed almost too good to be true. "You did this for me?" "I did this for us." Colt's voice was soft, "Sure. Because somewhere along the way, healing you became just as important to me as healing myself. And I realized that the biggest race I've ever run isn't toward any finish line, it's toward the life we could build together." Before she could respond, he dropped to one knee right there on the sidewalk, pulling a small velvet box from his other pocket. "Aubrey McLean, you healed my body, my heart, and my understanding of what it means to be strong. Will you marry me and let me spend the rest of my life running toward you instead of away from everything I'm afraid of?" Through tears of joy and surprise and overwhelming love, Aubrey looked down at the man who had taught her that sometimes the greatest healing happened when you stopped protecting yourself and started trusting someone else with your heart. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, absolutely yes." As Colt slipped the ring onto her finger and stood to kiss her in front of the track where he'd once felt so broken and alone, Aubrey realized that their story had come full circle in the most beautiful way possible. They had both been running when they found each other, him away from his shattered dreams, her away from the possibility of loving and losing again. But somewhere in the process of healing his body and opening their hearts, they had learned to run towards something infinitely more valuable than any race they could win. They had learned to run toward each other. 6 months later, in a small chapel in Colorado Springs with their families and friends surrounding them, Dr. Aubrey McLean became Mrs. Aubrey Rivers. And when they walked down the aisle together as husband and wife, it wasn't with the competitive urgency that had once defined their individual lives. It was with the steady, sure pace of two people who had found their rhythm together, who understood that the best races weren't about reaching the finish line first, they were about having someone wonderful to run alongside for the journey. Colt returned to competitive running eventually, but not in the way anyone expected. He ran not for times or medals or records, but for the pure joy of movement, the celebration of a body that had learned to trust again. His personal best times never matched his pre-injury achievements, but his happiness far exceeded anything he'd ever experienced as a champion. Aubrey's holistic treatment programs revolutionized sports medicine at the Olympic Training Center, proving that addressing emotional and psychological healing alongside physical recovery produced stronger, more resilient athletes. Her methods became the gold standard for treating not just elite competitors but anyone whose identity had been shattered by injury or loss. But more than their professional successes, more than the recognition or the career achievements, they treasured the simple moments, morning runs together through the Colorado foothills, quiet evenings planning their future, the profound intimacy of two people who had learned to see strength in vulnerability and beauty in healing. What spoke to your heart most in Colt and Aubrey's journey? Have you ever discovered strength you didn't know you had through someone's love and belief in you? I'd love to read your stories in the comments, they inspire every story I share. 1 year after their wedding, as they stood together at the starting line of Colt's first post-injury competitive race, a local 5K run for charity. Aubrey squeezed his hand and smiled. "Ready?" she asked. More than ready, he replied, but his eyes weren't on the track ahead. They were on her face, on the woman who had taught him that the greatest victory wasn't crossing any finish line first. It was finding someone worth running toward for the rest of your life. If this story touched your heart, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to Dear Love Diaries for more passionate stories of healing and love. And don't forget to hit the bell so you'll be the first to know when tomorrow's story unfolds. Thank you for being part of this beautiful community of hearts. Your presence makes all the difference.